Hello everybody, this is Sarah Scott on behalf of the Center for Hellenic Studies in Washington DC, here with Leonard Muellner. We're looking at the forums for the ancient Greek hero, and we've got a number of topics that have come up, issues that have come up. And the first one is talking about the advice of Nestor to his son in Iliad 23. And he's talking about the turning point and giving him his son advice about the chariot race. And it's a passage. It is either the tomb, the sēma of some mortal who died a long time ago, or was a turning point, a nusa, in the times of earlier man. And then it also talks about that it had either been an oak or a pine. And so maybe, Lenny, you could help us think about this, because you know, how can you not know which it is and what's going on here?
Yes. So there are a lot of places where the epic narrator says that something can be one thing or the other thing. Maybe you remember, you see things like this in Homeric similes, where sometimes they say so-and-so is like a lion or a boar, and stuff like that. So what's underlying these sorts of two ways of looking at something is the concept, I think, that Greg articulates, that Professor Naj, if you want, articulates in The Hero in 24 Hours, and that perhaps inhabits all of what we want to talk about a little bit today. And this is the notion of an ainos. The ainos is, the word ainos, we have a derivative of it in English in the word enigma, which in the Greek form of that was enigma. But basically an ainos also means a fable. For example, a fable of Aesop is in Greek an ainos. And the basic idea is quite simple in its in a complicated way. That an ainos is I think the simplest signature is one code, at least two messages. Okay, so there's one message that you may get on the surface, and there's another message that's underlying the code. So the most famous example is the story of the oracle. The Delphic oracle does this to people. There's the famous king of Lydia, who asked the oracle before he was going into battle whether he was going to win or lose. The Delphic oracle replied, "A great kingdom will be lost." So he assumes that it was the other guys. Okay, so this is an ambivalent expression that needs to be decoded properly. Okay, so he ended up losing. So in the case of the lion or the boar, what's going on there is that you have a whole sort of notion of what are the symbolic values of different animals, and in a specific context, a simile can be only about a lion or only about a boar, and the context difference is that lions are aggressive attackers, whereas boars are aggressive defenders. Okay, so in a situation where the issue is not whether you're attacking or defending, but the aggressiveness of the animal, you can make a simile about either one. Okay, so if you understand the system, you can understand why you have two ways of constructing a given experience. I don't have an answer about the oak or the pine, but I think if we wanted to understand this, and here's the overarching point, what we need to do is to really get into the world of epic conventions and understand what's not on the surface. Okay, and that comes from reading and rereading and rereading the text and seeing what are the normal ways of doing things, just like my example of the different ways in which you can distinguish between a lion and a boar. I learned that because I looked at every simile there was about lions and boars and start to figure out why you had one case and one of the other, and it turns out to be quite simple. Okay, but if you don't do, in the culture where all these things are these traditional texts and their value systems and their symbols are something that everyone has been learning about for a long time, this comes with the territory. But for us, we have to rebuild these things. So the answer to the question about Homeric nuances is that this is a traditional medium, and it's been repeated and developed and expanded, and its meanings have been enriched by repetition over generations. And we're looking at it in another language than its original, okay? But it's not such a great obstacle, because still there are the words and the concepts are there, and you can learn about how it all works. And you can figure out things by reading the translations, which are very careful translations, yourselves, and understand things that no one else has understood before either. And Sarah can back me up on that, right, Sarah? That happens.
Yeah. The mists gradually start to dissipate, and you start to see a little bit more clarity.
Yes. So the key notion that there's a teacher of Professor Naja's and mine, Albert Lord, who studied oral traditions in Yugoslavia in the 1930s and in the 40s and 50s as well. What he says is every element in a traditional poem has depth. Okay, it's not just on the surface. Okay, so what if we now switch to the question about whose tomb it is and how to understand what's said in Hero in 24 Hours about that. I noticed there's a long discussion and a lot of very interesting points and things being said about the tomb that is the turning point, or the tomb or the turning point. Okay, that's the way the poet says it. It's either the tomb of someone who died a long time ago or the turning point in an old race. Okay, so why do you have this? The first question you might ask is, why is it one or the other? Okay, and the answer that you can learn from the Hero in 24 Hours is that actually it's both. Okay, that turning points in races historically are tombs of dead heroes. Okay, and so you have archaeological evidence, but you also have the evidence of the poem that this is in other races, chariot races, that are described in other epic traditions and other traditions too in Greek, where you have this confluence of the two things. So in reality, the poet says it could be one or the other, but the reality is that it's both in the historical sense. Okay, so there's a discussion then of whose tomb is it? Okay, and what Professor Naj says in the Hero in 24 Hours is that this is really an ainos. Okay, on the surface, it's inside the epic tradition itself. Okay, it's clearly the tomb of some previous person, and the poet wants us to understand that for the epic audience, inside the epic, okay, not outside the epic, it's some long forgotten hero's tomb. Okay, that's being used as a starting point. It's really both things, but from the point of view of the actual audience of the performance of the epic, you say to yourself, wait a minute now, for me, a tomb of an ancient hero who died in Troy, what's that going to be? Okay, it's not just what it means on the surface, but when you think in terms of the resonance of the poetry and how it will look to a later audience, there's another way of understanding it, is that from our point of view, it could be understood as the tomb of Patroklos, that actually there's even more to this particular tomb in terms of the way that, in antiquity, the Trojan Peninsula was a kind of Disneyland. Okay, this is not my word for it. There were organized trips to go and see Troy and the various monuments there and the tombs of heroes that were there. Okay, so this is something that people really knew about. Okay, and we have stories of guides taking people around the different parts of the Troad and showing them the tombs of different heroes. So in that context, then you can see how it might be something actually on the surface is, all right, this is definitely in the poem itself, it's the tomb of someone else. Okay, But from the point of view of the audience, what they will associate that tomb with is the tomb of Patroklos, who's the person who's just died in the story. Okay, so it can be two things at once. Okay, there's a surface meaning and there's an underlying one that will resonate for the audience. This is an example of how having an enhanced concept of the audience and of the traditions and the social and the archaeological context in this case also can be helpful in reading the text. Is that a clarifying point to make, Sarah? Do you have any?
I think we've been noticing in other contexts as well how the poetry almost kind of takes a look back in on itself in places. And I was just looking at a passage from earlier in the Iliad in Rhapsody 7 when Hector's setting a challenge for single combat, and he says, if I win, I'll take the armor, you'll have the body, so that the Achaeans may richly prepare him and pile up for him a tomb, sēma, on the shore of the Hellespont. And someday, someone from a future generation will say, as he's sailing across the sea, this is the tomb of a man who died a long time ago, who was performing his Aristeia when Hector killed him.
It gives you the chills when you read that, right?
Because I didn't see it first time through, but once I'd come back to it a second or a third time, it suddenly went, hold on, that reminds me of...
It's exactly this kind of thing. Or another beautiful example is when you first see Helen in the third book, she's weaving, okay? And what is she weaving? She's weaving the battle of the Greeks and the Trojans about herself, okay? So here you have inside the epic a representation of the story that's being told. Those sorts of things are really amazing moments, okay? So this way of folding back on itself, as you say, is important, and reaching out through the illusion of the poetry into your life, into your world, so to speak, as we're breaking through a little bit. It's a very sophisticated medium that you're dealing with, and it does all kinds of cool things if you get tuned into them. But it's a matter of kind of not reading it the first time. Like you said, the second time, all of a sudden it strikes you, wow, I see what's going on here.
Yeah, those aha moments are just...
It may not be until the fifth time, but it's all right. It's all good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and from some of the other questions coming up in the forums, people have been picking out passages that I've never really paid attention to before.
Yes, exactly.
Let's look at that.
Yeah. I thought there was one that you commented on about in the funeral games for Patroklos, as to, I think this is a really important point, and where at one point there's a dispute that happens in the people who are watching, and I can't remember who it is who says we'll have our own race, and Agamemnon will decide who's the victor, right? And you point out that that may happen within that story, but what happens then is that Achilles settles the dispute. Okay, so you really get to figure out who's in charge of the games. I think it's very important to see that Achilles is the person who's distributing the prizes. Okay. And just to make us a little point that might be helpful is, in actual athletic contexts in Greece, which are all of them are the Olympic Games, for example, are funeral games for dead heroes. Okay, we talked about this a little bit last time, so funeral games is a context for athletic contexts. In actual games like the Olympics, you either won or you lost. Okay, there was no bronze, gold, bronze, and silver medals in the ancient Olympics. Okay, there was one winner and everybody else lost. Okay, what does Achilles do in the context of this funeral game? He gives everybody prizes, right? Even you get a prize for coming in last at one point, okay, and because he's what's going on here? And you brought up the point, why does Agamemnon get a prize without even competing? Okay, so I think here's what I think the point is, that when you have this is an anthropologist named Claude Lévi-Strauss made this point about games, okay, that there are we're used to games in which you have a winner and a loser. This is a sort of zero-sum game, the Greek way of doing it. But there are some cultures, for example, when anthropologists taught people in a certain population in New Guinea how to play soccer or football, whatever your way of word for it is, they would play for days and days until they came to a tie, and then they would go home, okay? The notion that one would lose and the other would win is too painful for them, okay? Or another example that Lévi-Strauss talks about, this is in a book called La Pensée Sauvage, Savage Thought, okay? Is that the Fox Indians at funerals, they have a lacrosse game. You may not know what lacrosse is, but it's a game with a goal. You play with a stick that has a net in it, and you try to get a ball into your opponent's goal. Okay, so in funeral games among the Fox Indians or Plains Indians in America, you had two teams, the living and the dead. Okay. And the game was fixed. The dead always won, okay, because you had to pacify the dead, all right? So this is not our concept of games, but ritualized games are like this, okay? So what does it mean that Achilles gives everyone prizes? Instead of creating, here's the word that Lévi-Strauss uses, is disjunction in a game in which one person loses it, if one person wins and everyone else loses, you have a kind of coming together in these games where everyone gets compensated, okay? And it's a very different model from, for example, the problem that comes up in the beginning of the Iliad, where Achilles got his prize, everyone got distributed a prize, and then Agamemnon took his away, right? And so I think he, as the king in charge of the games, does something that's much more of a bringing together of the community in a very extraordinary way, and in a way that Greeks would have experienced as exceptional too. Okay?
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful, and realised that wasn't, as it were, normal.
Yeah.
Because it's the only real ritualised games I've really read about. So yeah.
Yep.
So Leonard, there's another topic that's come up about how the Trojans are presented. And compared to the Greeks, they seem to be so similar, and yet they would presumably have been, different customs and different language, and yet they're presented very much the same as the Greeks. Maybe you could talk about that.
Already done everything that needs. You said everything I think about this in the forum, Sarah, about the Luvians and the traditions. There's just one little point that I think is fun to think about with this, and that is in ancient Greek there are two words for enemy. This is not my work, but the work of a professor in New York named Laura Slatkin, who figured all this out. There are two words for enemy. One is ekthros, okay, and that means someone. And it means a personal enemy, okay? And the opposite of it is the word philos. There's another word for enemy which means a military enemy, a group in force, okay? But let's stick with this older word. The word philos is a really important concept in the Iliad too, because, for example, everything is about who are your philoi, who are the people who are near and dear to you, okay, and also who are your enemies. But what Laura Slatkin showed is that in order for somebody to have an ekthros, that person, to be your personal enemy, that person has to have formerly been your philos, okay? That is, the real enemies, the enemies that drive you crazy are former friends who've turned against you, okay, in the Greek context. And so being able to experience Trojans as people who are sort of like us, okay, this relates to a sort of fundamental notion of hostility. You don't have real hostility against people who are totally different from you in this context. You have to have some kind of relationship that gets broken, okay, and that's what happened, right? The Helen got taken, okay, in a situation where she shouldn't have. So you can see that I think this the Greekness of the Trojans corresponds to a very powerful notion of hostility, but I think it's also very, very true that the Trojans are people with whom the Greek audience can identify. And even it's been shown recently by a wonderful archaeologist and art historian named Gloria Pinney, that in the Athenian context, on the Acropolis in the 5th century, it's pretty clear that the Athenians didn't identify with the Greeks in the Trojan War. They identified with the Trojans, okay? The people who are the losers, okay? So this is not a simple situation, okay? So, you know, you can have a sympathy for the people who lose just in an ancient Greek context, just as we do. And that's enabled by their Greekness, if you will, okay, and their sympathetic nature. Okay,
Yeah,
I said maybe more than I should have said about enemies, but I think it's a beautiful topic, and this notion of otherness needs to be understood in the sense of otherness, but similarity too. Okay, all right.
Okay, great.